Okay, we have started.
Perfect. Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our info session today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brogan. I am an employer coach here at Goodwill Industries of Alberta, and I will be presenting today. The presentation should run about 15 to 20 minutes with time for questions at the end. So today we will be covering inclusive hiring with a focus on job postings and interviews. However, like our last presentation, I think that many of the learnings today will have the potential to be beneficial for all staff, not just those with disabilities. Just so you know, today's session is being hosted by the Employer Inclusion Accelerator program here at Goodwill. This is our agenda for today. We will be covering the topics broadly, but if you join for future info sessions, we will be diving into different aspects of the inclusive employment process more in depth. So hopefully you can join us next month. We also have a monthly newsletter. If you guys want to sign up for that, we'll have more info at the end. And that one, we would deliver kind of monthly tips and tricks right to your inbox. So that's another option if you can't join the presentation. So firstly, I want to mention some information about Goodwill and our new Employer Inclusion Accelerator program. So Goodwill is an international organization that is committed to providing community-based supports for people with barriers to employment. Here in Alberta, we are committed to supporting people with disabilities to find meaningful employment. So what does that look like? By donating to and shopping at our thrift stores, you help fund programs and supports for people with disabilities to find and sustain employment. And I have to mention, we are also committed to sustainability. So unsold items are donated, upcycled, and recycled where possible. It's a really cool model. Well, Goodwill has a variety of programs and initiatives. I will just mention the Employer Inclusion Accelerator, or EIA program. So the EIA program is a new program that was created with the goal of helping employers to become more inclusive of people with disabilities. So we work with employers to identify opportunities for people with disabilities in their organizations. We can provide training, coaching, resources around hiring and employment. And we can also help employers advertise their job ads directly to people with disabilities. So we are connected with a variety of community partners, and we are always looking for more. So if you are from a support agency, please reach out to us. Because then when we find employers that have opportunities for people with disabilities, we share those job ads directly. Today's presentation is an example of some of the training the EIA team can provide, and everything is free. So you have nothing to lose by reaching out to us if you have any questions or you want to try to collaborate. So before we get into some facts and statistics on disability, I want to start by going over the language we'll be using. For the purposes of this presentation, we will be using person-first language. So person-first language is a convention that emphasizes the person before the disability. For example, a person with autism as opposed to an autistic person. It's generally considered the most respectful way to refer to a person with a disability, if you even need to discuss the disability at all. But we want to acknowledge that there are many people who prefer identity-first language, such as deaf person. So it's always best to ask someone how they would like to be referred to. Okay, so let us start by discussing some definitions. So disability is an umbrella term that's often used to refer to a condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities. There are a variety of disability types. So here are some here. Some of these you're probably familiar with, and some of them you might not be. But basically, disability is the umbrella term for all of these conditions or experiences. Whereas impairment is a specific limitation in a body function or structure. So when we look at these definitions, we understand that a disability is an experience in addition to an impairment due to the structures or the societies that may not be inclusive. So this is kind of the model that we'll be using for today's presentation. And our hope is that we can help start addressing those structures and systems and making them more inclusive. Okay, so slide 8 here. I want to touch on some employment for persons with disabilities in Canada. So as you can see, individuals with disabilities are underemployed in comparison with people without disabilities. You can see from these statistics that around 50% of Canadians with disabilities are unemployed. And this number is actually significantly higher for people with intellectual disabilities who experience unemployment in excess of 80%. And these numbers are so disappointing when you consider that there are at least 645,000 Canadians with disabilities who have the potential to work, but aren't working. So for people who like numbers, approximately 40% of Canadians with disabilities are unemployed and want to and can work. So of course, inclusive hiring emerges as a way to reach this untapped talent pool. And there are some noteworthy benefits to hiring people with disabilities or businesses that hire inclusively in general. So the data on this slide was taken from an RWA survey on businesses or organizations that have hired inclusively. They found that of respondents, 87% of people would prefer to give their businesses to companies who hire inclusively. 92% of respondents rated inclusive companies more favorably than their competitors. There was a 93% retention rate for employees that were hired by businesses that worked with agencies supporting people with disabilities. So inclusive organizations have a really high retention rate, not just for the people with disabilities, but for other staff as well. It's a culture, right? And finally, people with disabilities were actually rated as well or better than average on turnover by 97% of employers. So with these stats in mind, why wouldn't you want to hire inclusively? Well, you might be thinking about some of the barriers and challenges. So let's talk about them. Firstly, one of the major barriers to inclusive hiring and inclusion in general is attitude. Attitudinal barriers are behaviors, perceptions, and assumptions that discriminate against people with disabilities. So these barriers often come from a lack of understanding, which can lead people to ignore, judge, or have misconceptions about a person with a disability. So I have kind of an example on the slide, but I want to throw the question out to the group. Can you think of examples of attitudinal barriers that you've encountered? And if you don't want to jump in, that's totally fine. Alicia and I will share some that we've seen. Feel free to unmute or pop in the chat. Just give everyone no pressure if you don't want to.
I can definitely start with something that comes to mind right away. Is I've definitely heard a stereotype that comes up a lot is people with disabilities cannot work safely. And that is far from the truth. That has nothing to do with an individual's disability. That's a stereotype that I can think of.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you or me, some people may work safely, some people may not. And it's important to think about how we can support people to understand the expectations and how do we support people to know how to work safely. It's a great example. So generally assumptions about disability and what people can or cannot do. So the next barrier are organizational or systemic barriers. So organizational or systemic barriers are things like policies, procedures, or practices that unfairly discriminate against people with disabilities. So they're often put in place unintentionally. Can anyone think of any that might be at their place of work or their employer, like any systems or processes that might exclude people? No, no worries. Alicia and I have some examples too.
Sorry, I was just reading the chat. I'll get back to that. But one that I can definitely think of, and it's something that's, really happened a lot with COVID, is, in-person versus remote. And that's a big thing where a lot of companies have been working, at home, and that hybrid model. And that's something that definitely comes to mind for organizational.
And so actually working hybrid and working remote has increased opportunities for people with disabilities. So surveys have found that people with disabilities are actually reaching higher levels of employment in 2022. So this isn't a 2023 statistic than they did before COVID, which is really interesting. And I think I can't speak to that personally, but I wonder if it's people have opportunities to work from home where transportation might have been a barrier, or maybe office settings for people with anxiety were a barrier, but now they have the option to work in a comfortable place. So although in some cases we can't completely get away from office work, that's something you can think about. If it's possible to work remotely, why not? Okay, moving on to the next one, architectural and physical barriers. I think this one probably gets talked about a lot, but we'll just cover it briefly here. So there are elements of buildings or spaces that create barriers to people with disabilities. And I'll just let Alicia jump right in. We'll give the examples. I'm sure you guys have others though that you've seen.
Yeah, definitely. So a lot that come to mind, right, is, sidewalks, stairs, even think of doorknobs. All of those contribute to that. Even lighting.
Yeah, Lighting is an interesting one. That one was new for Alicia and I when we were thinking about this presentation. Someone maybe moving on information. So communication disabilities such as hearing or seeing or learning disabilities.
I might just stop you for a second, Brogan. Maybe it's just
the sending.
It might just be on my end, Brogan. Sorry, but
Absolutely.
It totally chopped out what you were just saying before.
Or we audio.
Just your next example. I couldn't hear you. It chopped out.
The information and communications?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, I'll start. I'll start from that one again. Oh, another important category is information and communications. So information or communication barriers occur when sensory disabilities, such as hearing, seeing, or learning disabilities, have not been considered. So these barriers relate to both the sending and receiving of information. Does anyone have any examples that they want to share for this, or should Alicia and I just jump right in? Perfect. No worries. We can jump right in. Alicia, do you have any that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, definitely think about when we see videos and if they're not captioned, right? How to get that information for somebody.
Yeah.
Something, right?
And plain language too. That's another one. So sometimes the wording of job ads or the wording of training sessions might be quite verbose or quite confusing. Idioms,
100%.
expressions, that could be really confusing for someone with a disability. And it's something to think about whether or not you need that. So yeah, we'll move on to, so that's technological. So technological barriers occur when a device or platform is not accessible to its intended audience and cannot be used with assistive devices. So technology can enhance the user experience, but it can also create completely unintentional barriers for some. So technological barriers are often kind of intertwined with information and communication because technology is one of the mediums that we use to communicate. But there are some kind of specific examples that might fall into the technological category. Alicia, do you want to just jump in and share some?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we start with that, I think it's definitely documents that might not work with screen readers or certain third-party websites that just aren't going to be compatible, right?
Absolutely. And that's something to think about with your training systems. So if you have systems in place for training employees, are they accessible and can they be accommodated for people that might need adaptive technology?
And with the onboarding too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I know it's probably overwhelming to talk about all these barriers, but there are so many simple ways that we can begin addressing them. And so today we will be talking about some strategies and accommodations at the job posting and interview stages. But if you continue to join us for our sessions, we're going to go more in depth about the whole inclusive hiring process. All right, so let's start with inclusive job postings. Today, we have kind of divided into two categories, things to think about and then some food for thought. So when you're making a job posting, if possible, use plain language and keep it simple. I've heard, I don't know if this is something everyone else has heard, that you should target your text as if you are addressing kind of a fourth grade level, because we know that not all Canadians and not all people have access to the tools and skills to be maybe fully literate even, and that's a completely separate barrier. But it's easy for us to adapt our communication style to meet everybody. So use plain language, keep it simple. Where possible, use larger text. I'm going to be honest, I'm a little guilty in this presentation. The next slide is text heavy and the text is small, but where you're able, larger text is a great modification for someone that might have vision limitations. Confirm that your posting is compatible with accessibility software. There are agencies that can help with this, we can help with this as well. But you want to make sure that the documents, the websites, the screens that you're using can be read by like text-to-speech software. So that's something to think about. When you put your job posting out there, state clearly if you have flexibility in things like shift times, length, days of work, work location. Make that completely clear to the reader, because some people that may feel that they're limited in applying because they don't have access to transportation in the morning. They have to rely on specific support systems. Maybe their aides are in from 8 to 4. And so if you're flexible, if you could accommodate that, say that in your job ad. And state clearly if you accept resumes or applications in person. So for a lot of people, technology is a barrier, and that's not just people with disabilities. So if you're able to have someone phone you or fax you or drop something off, perfect. Let them know and let them know how to do it. And then the food for thought, avoiding the complex language, things like idioms, expressions like speech phrases that could be confusing or misconstrued. If you can leave them out, do that. Avoid discriminatory language. So this is kind of comes from an internal place of remembering what our biases might be and thinking about how we can communicate most respectfully with people. So one thing I saw in a job ad recently, I'll give an example, is I saw a job ad say something along the lines of, we do everything right here. We're a little bit OCD. And while that joke might feel kind of harmless to the general population, we understand it could be something that we saying to someone that does have OCD and feels limited or struggles with that. So think about that when you put that in your job ad. Don't use requirements or must-haves. State if something is modifiable or adaptable. So do you need someone to drive, or do you need them to have reliable transportation? Does someone have to be able to move 50 pounds, or do they have to be able to lift 50 pounds, or do they not have to do that at all? So think about that when you're writing those job ads. And don't use blanket statements. So if you don't need experience, don't say 1 to 2 years experience required. If you're willing to train someone, let them know that. We have this example. I know, text heavy. Don't worry about reading it all. I'm just going to kind of call out the specific pieces of this that I want you to focus in on. So first of all, plain language, clear. There's no verbose, there's no explanations. It just tells you what the responsibilities are. It's short, it's easy to read. Flexibility. So you need someone for 20 hours per week, but the times and the lengths of the shift are flexible. State that. So do you need them from 8 to 4? You can put that in, but if you're willing to change those hours or work with their schedule, let them know. These two kind of go hand in hand. A lot of job ads will say requires Class 5 license when actually they just need someone to be able to get to the job site, and must be able to lift 50 pounds or must be able to move 50 pounds, because a lot of people with disabilities may not complete tasks in the same way that the general population does. Maybe they use assistive technology or assistive devices to help them move something, or maybe they just use a dolly like anybody would. So make sure you're thinking about the language you're using in your job ads and how you're conveying what you need from employees. Then this last one, so avoid blanket statements. A lot of job ads will just throw in experience required. If experience isn't required, or if you're willing to accommodate that, make sure that that's really clear. Here we go, state how to apply and give options. So for people with technological barriers or maybe learning difficulties, technology can be really confusing. Navigating Indeed, signing up for the account, that's confusing for me, I'll be honest. So if you're willing to accept in person, by mail, let people know in your job ad. And finally, I think I'm seeing this more recently, but consider including an accommodation statement, how people can get accommodations, what you're willing to do, and state clearly within this accommodation statement how people can reach out to you. Sometimes online forms can be tricky. So if you can give options like a phone call or an email, that's really, really great, really helpful. Okay, inclusive interviews. So again, we have kind of the things that you can try to do, things that you should think about. So if possible, be flexible with the time, location, and the interview format. Does it need to be in person? Can it be on Zoom? Does it need to be on Teams, phone calls? If possible, you can reach out to the candidate and ask what they're most comfortable with. That's an easy way to make someone feel heard, and often modifying the medium of communication is pretty easy. Try to be consistent where you can with people and processes. I think it's confusing for most of us if you get a phone call from one person and your interviews with the next, but you have a contact point who's a third party. If possible, keep it limited or make it very clear who will be communicating and at what time. This is one that I think is really helpful, is providing interview questions ahead of time. And so for some people, especially people that might have maybe an intellectual or developmental disability, they might need a little bit more time to think about how to answer and to be able to come up with an answer that really truly represents what they're thinking and feeling. So if you give them those questions ahead of time, they can then begin thinking about what they want to say, how they want to say it, and how they want to convey their experiences. And you might be able to have a much more thoughtful dialogue with that person if you give them those questions ahead of time. Next, providing adequate time for a candidate to think and respond. I'm definitely guilty of filling kind of that blank space in communication with my own words, but sometimes people need more time to think about what they want to say, and it's really not helpful if you prompt or if you probe or if you kind of move on. So try to give them the time that they need to answer a question, and you can always ask, do you need more time? Can I help you at all with your answer? Try not to fill the space. And then finally, be open to accommodations throughout the process and just ask the person, what can I do? Is there any way I can help you? And if you can't help them, that's okay. You can be honest, but opening up the lines of communication will help you understand how you can be more inclusive along the way. And so here we go, those kind of things to think about. Try to avoid small talk, complex language, idioms, sarcasm. These can get lost in translation. I think we all know that, like via email, it's really hard to read tone sometimes. And some people feel that way about idioms and sarcasm in person as well. So just think about that. Avoid group interviews. It's hard, I think, to shine in a group setting, and especially if you might have anxiety or if you do need more time to think about things. Group interviews can be a place that people will not be able to express themselves to their best of their abilities. So if you can avoid that, that's great. Noises and distractions, lighting, scents. Really, really bright rooms or really, really dim rooms might be a little bit off-putting, or if your lights are flickering or if there's strong smells. These are little things. I think a lot of offices nowadays have kind of rules around this, but something to consider. This is a really important one, the next one here, but avoid directing questions to someone's aide or their advocate. You're interviewing the person with the disability, and it's a little bit disrespectful if you're speaking to the person who's with them because you're kind of not communicating with who you need to be communicating with. The only time I would reach out to the aide or advocate is if you want to confirm that there's something you could be doing better or learning from them about how best to communicate with the person. But where possible, you're speaking to the person with the disability. And don't forget follow-up feedback. If you want to let someone know they didn't get a job, let them know, offer the feedback and offer them that information so that they have the chance to do better next time. It can be really confusing and really disheartening when someone interviews and they don't hear back. So whatever you can do to ease that would be really helpful and something that you can consider. So next we have a video here. I'm hoping it plays. Oh, it's not gonna, slide's not gonna change. Oh, there we go. So I'm gonna play this. It's just a short video and it's from kind of a large company, Microsoft. So it gives you an example of how really big scale organizations can do this. What can you do at home? What can you do in your own business? And it's not exhaustive, but some of the things that we discussed will be in this video for sure. So I'm hoping it plays. I'm just going to exit out of this here and I'll try playing it like this.
Inclusive interviewing at a glance.
Oh, we're having technical difficulties today. Okay. Try one more time, and if not, we'll skip this, but we'll send it out afterwards for you guys all to watch.
Inclusive interviewing at a glance. Hi, I'm Lisa, and I'm here to explore some best practices for inclusive interviewing that I use here at Microsoft. The most important first step is to solicit requests for accommodations early and often in the recruitment process. Our recruiters ask about accommodation requests before the candidate's arrival, either by email or by phone. The recruiter simply asks, "Do you require an accommodation for your interview?" By asking and responding promptly to candidates' requests, we work with them to evaluate which specific accommodations could set them up for success in their interviews. Next, we consider the interview location carefully. For example, if a candidate tells me they use a wheelchair or other mobility device, then I schedule the interviews in a single location where all interviewers can come to the candidate. Rather than having the candidate move locations, they remain in a single, comfortable space. Many traditional interviews include hands-on exercises where candidates respond to questions by drawing on a whiteboard. I encourage candidates to bring their own computers for a more accessible experience. For example, a candidate who is blind can answer a technical coding question using their preferred assistive technology on their own computer.
int I equals 0.
Finally, during the recruitment process, many candidates meet with multiple interviewers in a day. I schedule breaks between each interviewer. Candidates have time to rest in a quiet room, collect their thoughts, and get a beverage. This creates a more inclusive environment where candidates can perform at their best. Thanks for watching and sharing in our journey towards a more inclusive culture. Together, if we create inclusive interviews, we empower all candidates to shine. To learn more, visit Microsoft.com.
Perfect. Okay, sorry about those technical difficulties there, but let's see if we can jump back into the slides. There we go. So as we're wrapping up today, I want to share our contact information. So please reach out if you have any questions. We also have that monthly newsletter I mentioned that you can sign up for, where you will receive regular tips and tricks directly to your inbox. If you're interested in receiving the newsletter, feel free to leave your email in the chat, direct message Alicia in the chat, or reach out to EIA@goodwill.ab.ca. We are more than happy to send that to you, and you can unsubscribe at any time. With that being said, does anybody have any questions that they want to ask right now as we're finishing up? See something in the chat here. No, no question there. I'll just give everyone like 20 seconds. You can unmute, you can pop it in the chat. If not, no worries at all. And I think Alicia is just keeping an eye on the chat there.
I sure am.
Okay.
Just got thank you so much for your presentation. It was very helpful. That's really nice to hear.
Thank you so much, Alice. Okay, well, I'm just going to say it sounds like no one has questions right now, but we are always open, and the EIA team is here to support you as you're thinking about inclusive hiring. And if you're a partner, please reach out. We want to work with you to facilitate the meaningful inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of community life. So with that being said, thank you all so much for coming today. Feel free to join us next month as we dive into the inclusive onboarding process. Thank you everyone for joining. You can stay on too if you have any questions that you want to ask outside of the group setting. We're going to stay here. Thank you everyone. Thank you so much for all the messages in the chat too. And I guess we could probably stop our recording, Alicia.
100%. You got that.
Awesome.